Margaret's house stood like a monument to quieter times, its rooms filled with the weight of memories and the echo of footsteps that no longer came. At 78, she had become a master of small routines that filled the endless hours between dawn and dusk. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked each passing moment with mechanical precision, a reminder of how time moved forward even when life seemed suspended at amber. Her morning ritual never varied: tea brewed in the same blue china cup, toast cut into precise triangles, and the newspaper read cover to cover, even the advertisements. These small acts gave structure to days that otherwise threatened to blur together into one continuous stream of solitude. She would sit by the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood come alive with purposeful movement while she remained still, a spectator to the world's daily dance. The telephone on the side table remained stubbornly silent, its black surface reflecting her own hesitation each time she considered reaching for it. She had stopped calling her daughter Sarah weeks ago, convinced that her voice on the other end brought obligation rather than joy. The weight of feeling like a burden had settled into her bones, heavier than arthritis, more persistent than her chronic cough. Her reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman she barely recognized, gray hair thinning at the temples, shoulders curved inward as if protecting a secret wound. She had become careful with her words, measuring each conversation for signs that she was asking too much, staying too long, needing more than she could give in return. The fear of being unwanted had transformed every interaction into a delicate negotiation. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, as autumn light filtered through lace curtains and dust motes danced in golden beams, the doorbell rang with unexpected urgency. Margaret's heart quickened as she approached the front door, her hand trembling slightly on the brass knob. Through the peephole, she glimpsed a familiar small figure that would change everything she believed about her place in this world. 8-year-old Tommy stood on her doorstep with his backpack sliding off one shoulder and his shoelaces trailing behind him like forgotten thoughts. His face, flushed from running, broke into a grin that reminded Margaret so powerfully of her late husband that she had to steady herself against the doorframe. Sarah's car was nowhere to be seen, which meant this visit was entirely Tommy's idea, a realization that sent both warmth and worry coursing through her chest. "Grandma," he announced, pushing past her gentle protests and into the familiar dimness of her living room. His energy seemed to illuminate corners that had grown accustomed to shadows, his voice bouncing off walls that had forgotten the sound of laughter. Margaret watched him with a mixture of delight and anxiety, already calculating how quickly she could contact Sarah without making Tommy feel unwelcome. The boy moved through her space with the confidence of someone who belonged, touching familiar objects and settling into the worn velvet armchair that had been his grandfather's favorite spot. His presence transformed the room's atmosphere from mournful to expectant, as if the house itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Margaret found herself moving differently, her steps lighter, her voice warmer than it had been in months. "Mom's working late again," Tommy explained, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to adult complications. "I remembered the way here from school. I wanted to see you because—" He paused, his young face serious with the weight of unspoken thoughts. His honesty hung in the air between them, raw and unfiltered by the careful politeness that usually governed her interactions with adults. Margaret settled into the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the room, but something had shifted in the quality of the silence. It no longer felt empty, but expectant, pregnant with possibilities she had stopped allowing herself to imagine. The conversation that followed unfolded with the natural rhythm of rivers finding their course to the sea. Tommy spoke about school with the dramatic flair that only children possess, turning mundane classroom events into epic adventures. Margaret found herself leaning forward, genuinely curious about his teacher's new haircut and the cafeteria's mystery meat that had sparked a student revolt. She had forgotten how refreshing honesty could be when unfiltered by adult diplomacy. In return, she began sharing stories from her own childhood, tales that had grown dusty from disuse but sparkled when viewed through Tommy's interested eyes. She told him about the summer she had caught fireflies in mason jars, believing she could create her own constellation. Her voice grew stronger with each memory, as if the act of sharing them was breathing life back into experiences she had thought buried forever. Tommy listened with the intense focus that children reserve for stories that capture their imagination completely. He asked questions that adults had stopped asking years ago. What did the fireflies feel like in your hands? And did they make noise when they flew? His curiosity transformed her memories from faded photographs into vivid, living scenes that felt as real as the afternoon light streaming through the windows. As the hours passed, Margaret noticed how naturally they had fallen into a rhythm of give and take, story and response. The boy's presence had awakened something in her that she had thought permanently dormant, the desire to connect, to share, to matter in someone else's narrative. She watched him with growing amazement, this small person who had chosen to spend his afternoon with her rather than anywhere else in the world. The shadows were lengthening across the living room floor when Tommy suddenly grew quiet, his expression shifting to something more thoughtful and serious. Margaret sensed a change in the atmosphere, as if they were approaching the real reason for his unexpected visit. She waited, her heart beginning to beat faster, unprepared for the profound simplicity of what would come next. Tommy's small fingers traced patterns on the armchair's worn fabric as he gathered his thoughts with the careful deliberation of someone much older. His usual animated chatter had given way to something deeper, more reflective, and Margaret found herself holding her breath in anticipation. The afternoon light had shifted, casting the room in golden hues that seemed to highlight the serious expression crossing her grandson's young face with unexpected gravity. "Grandma," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I heard Mom talking to Dad on the phone last night." The words hung in the air between them like delicate glass, fragile and sharp-edged. Margaret felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread, the old fear of being discussed as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. She wanted to stop him, to change the subject, before the conversation ventured into territory that might confirm her worst fears about being a burden. But Tommy's earnest expression held her captive, his innocence creating a space where difficult truths could be spoken without malice. She gripped the arms of her chair, preparing herself for words that might shatter the fragile peace they had built during this unexpected afternoon together. Tommy continued, his young voice heavy with confusion and concern. She kept saying she didn't know what to do, that she felt terrible about something. "I couldn't understand everything, but I heard your name a lot." Margaret's heart sank like a stone dropped into deep water, each word confirming her belief that she had become nothing more than a source of worry and obligation. The room seemed to grow smaller around them, the walls pressing inward with the weight of overheard conversations and adult anxieties. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, feeling the familiar ache of believing herself unwanted, unnecessary, a complication in her daughter's already busy life. When she opened them again, Tommy was watching her with the piercing clarity that children often possess, seeing more than adults often gave them credit for understanding. Margaret's throat tightened as she struggled to maintain composure in front of her grandson's searching gaze. The confirmation of her fears felt like a physical blow, validating every careful calculation she had made about limiting her needs, minimizing her presence, making herself as small as possible in her family's life. She had become expert at reading between the lines of brief phone calls and rushed visits, interpreting every pause as evidence of her unwelcome intrusion. A silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of adult complications that children shouldn't have to witness or understand. Margaret found herself calculating how quickly she could contact Sarah, how to explain Tommy's unexpected visit without causing additional stress, how to reassure her daughter that she hadn't asked him to come. The familiar dance of preemptive apology and self-diminishment began playing in her mind like a well-rehearsed script. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the teacup that had grown cold during their conversation, using the simple gesture to buy time while she composed herself. The afternoon that had begun with such unexpected joy now felt tainted by the reality of her position as a source of family stress. She wondered if Kami could see the disappointment etched across her features, the familiar resignation settling over her shoulders like an old, unwelcome shawl. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the half-hour with mechanical indifference, its steady rhythm marking time that suddenly felt precious and fleeting. Margaret realized that even this moment of connection with her grandson was probably causing Sarah additional worry, another item on an already overwhelming list of responsibilities. The joy she had felt at his unexpected arrival was now complicated by guilt and the urgent need to minimize any disruption his absence might cause. Tommy shifted in his chair, his small frame seeming to understand the gravity of the emotions playing across his grandmother's face. The innocent pleasure of their shared afternoon was transforming into something more complex, a collision between a child's simple desire for connection and the intricate web of adult obligations and fears that had grown around their family relationships like thorns around a rose. But Tommy's next words shattered Margaret's carefully constructed narrative of burden and unwelcome intrusion with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "She wasn't crying because you're too much trouble, Grandma," he said, his voice filled with the certainty that comes from seeing the world without adult complications. "She was crying because she misses you and doesn't know how to tell you." The simplicity of his observation hit Margaret like a thunderbolt, illuminating corners of possibility she had closed off months ago. His young face scrunched with concentration as he tried to find words he could feel but didn't fully understand. "She kept saying she was scared you thought she didn't care anymore, that work was keeping her too busy to be a good daughter." Margaret felt the ground beneath her assumptions shifting like sand, revealing a landscape entirely different from the one she had mapped in her mind. Tommy leaned forward with the earnestness that makes children such powerful truth-tellers, unaware that he was dismantling years of carefully constructed self-protection with each honest word. "She said she wanted to call you every day, but didn't know if you wanted to hear from her. She thought maybe you were mad at her for not visiting more." The irony struck Margaret with breathtaking force. Both mother and daughter had been protecting themselves from rejection, creating distance to avoid the pain of perceived unwelcome. The afternoon light shifted again, casting new shadows across the room, as if the physical world was adjusting to accommodate this seismic shift in understanding. Margaret stared at her grandson with growing amazement, this small messenger who had arrived at her door carrying truths she had been too afraid to imagine. His innocence had created a safe space where family secrets could be aired without judgment or blame. "I told her she should just call you," Tommy continued, with the pragmatic wisdom that children often possess about complicated adult situations. "But she said it wasn't that simple." His confusion was evident in the way he tilted his head, unable to comprehend why adults made simple things so difficult. Margaret felt something cracking open inside her chest, a frozen place that had been protecting her heart from hope and disappointment for longer than she cared to remember. The room seemed to hold its breath as Margaret processed this radical reinterpretation of events she thought she understood completely. All the careful distance she had maintained, all the phone calls she hadn't made to avoid being a burden, had been creating exactly the opposite effect. Her attempts at selflessness had been perceived as rejection, her consideration as withdrawal, her love as indifference. The revelation was both devastating and liberating, like discovering you've been reading a map upside down for years. Tommy continued with the relentless honesty that made his words both painful and healing. "She showed me pictures of when she was little and you were teaching her to bake cookies. She smiled when she talked about how patient you were, how you never got mad when she made messes." Margaret remembered those afternoons vividly, flour-covered countertops, Sarah standing on a chair to reach the mixing bowl, the sweet satisfaction of creating something together. She said she wants to bring me over more, but she's worried you might think we're bothering you, Tommy added, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. I told her that didn't make any sense because you're my grandma, and grandmas like it when their families visit. The simple logic of childhood cut through years of adult overthinking like a knife through silk, revealing the basic truth that had been obscured by fear and misunderstanding. Margaret felt tears beginning to gather at the corners of her eyes, not the bitter tears of loneliness she had grown accustomed to, but something different, the salt water of recognition, of grief for time lost to unnecessary caution, of hope tentatively unfurling like a flower after a long winter. Her grandson's words were reconstructing her understanding of her place in her family's life with each innocent revelation. The silence that followed felt different from the empty quiet that usually filled her house. This was the silence of possibility, of bridges being built across gaps that had seemed unbridgeable just hours earlier. Margaret watched Tommy's face, seeing in his features the echo of generations, the continuation of love that had never actually been broken, only temporarily obscured by fear and misunderstanding. Margaret felt tears beginning to gather at the corners of her eyes, not the bitter tears of loneliness she had grown accustomed to, but something different, the salt water of recognition, of grief for time lost to unnecessary caution, of hope tentatively unfurling like a flower after a long winter. Her grandson's words were reconstructing her understanding of her place in her family's life with each innocent revelation. The silence that followed felt different from the empty quiet that usually filled her house. This was the silence of possibility, of bridges being built across gaps that had seemed unbridgeable just hours earlier. Margaret watched Tommy's face, seeing in his features the echo of generations, the continuation of love that had never actually been broken, only temporarily obscured by fear and misunderstanding. Tommy shifted in his chair one more time, and Margaret could sense that he was building toward something important, something that had been weighing on his young mind throughout their conversation. His expression grew even more serious, and she found herself leaning forward, despite the emotional vertigo his previous revelations had created. The afternoon had already transformed her understanding of her family relationship so completely that she felt unprepared for whatever truth he might reveal next. "But you know what I told Mom?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying a weight that seemed far beyond his 8 years. Margaret shook her head, unable to find her voice, feeling as though she was standing at the edge of something profound and life-changing. The golden afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to intensify, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for his next words. Tommy's eyes met hers with the direct, uncomplicated gaze that children use when they're about to share something they consider fundamentally important. "I told her that you don't love someone because they're useful. You love them because they're yours." The simplicity of the statement hit Margaret with the force of absolute truth, stripping away years of accumulated self-doubt and fear in a single, devastating moment of clarity. The words hung in the air between them like a benediction, rewriting everything Margaret had believed about her worth and her place in her family's life. This child, with his 8-year-old wisdom, had articulated something that had eluded her for years of careful self-examination and worry. Love wasn't a transaction based on usefulness or convenience. It was a bond that existed independent of productivity or contribution. Margaret felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest, like ice breaking up after a long winter, allowing warmth to flow into spaces that had been frozen for longer than she cared to acknowledge. Tommy watched her face with the patient attention of someone who understands they have delivered an important message, waiting to see if his words had found their intended mark in his grandmother's wounded heart. The profound simplicity of Tommy's words continued to reverberate through Margaret's consciousness, like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that reached corners of her heart she had forgotten existed. She stared at her grandson with something approaching awe, marveling at how clearly he could see truths that adults manage to complicate beyond recognition, His unfiltered perspective had cut through decades of self-imposed limitations with surgical precision, revealing assumptions that had been quietly poisoning her relationships with their toxic logic. "You're mine, Grandma," Tommy continued, with the matter-of-fact certainty that children bring to statements of belonging. "And I'm yours. That's not going to change because you get older, or because you need help sometimes, or because you can't do everything you used to do." His words carried the weight of eternal truth, spoken with the confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt the fundamental bonds of family connection. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion as she began to understand how thoroughly she had misinterpreted the natural changes of aging as evidence of diminished worth. She had been measuring her value by standards that her own family had never applied, creating elaborate justifications for distance that no one else had requested or desired. The realization was both heartbreaking and liberating, like discovering that the prison door had been unlocked all along. The afternoon light continued its slow journey across the living room floor, marking the passage of time that had become meaningful again through the lens of connection rather than isolation. Margaret watched her grandson's animated face as he spoke, seeing in his features the continuation of her own story, the legacy that existed not in accomplishments or usefulness, but in the simple fact of love given and received across generations. Tommy's next words would prove to be the key that finally unlocked the door Margaret had built around her heart, though she didn't yet realize that the most profound revelation was still to come. His childlike wisdom was preparing to deliver one final truth that would transform not just her afternoon, but her entire understanding of what it meant to age gracefully within the embrace of family love. "Besides," Tommy added with a grin that transformed his serious expression into something purely joyful, "you tell the best stories, and you make the best hot chocolate, and you always smell like that perfume that reminds me of flowers." His catalog of her qualities continued with the detailed appreciation that only children possess, listing attributes she had long since stopped considering valuable. "And when you hug me, it feels different from other hugs, safer somehow, like nothing bad could happen." Margaret felt tears flowing freely now as she realized that her grandson's love for her had nothing to do with her ability to provide services or solve problems. He loved her for qualities that would persist regardless of physical limitations or the natural changes that accompanied aging. Her presence in his life was valuable not for what she could do, but for who she was and the unique way she made him feel cherished and secure. The revelation continued to unfold as Tommy enumerated more reasons for their connection. The way she listened to his stories without rushing him, how she remembered details about his friends and school that even his parents sometimes forgot, the special way she said his name that made him feel important. These were gifts that had nothing to do with youth or capability, and everything to do with the accumulated wisdom and attention that came with having lived long enough to understand what truly mattered. "When I'm with you, I don't have to be anything special," Tommy said, his honesty cutting straight to the heart of what it meant to offer unconditional acceptance. "You just like me because I'm me, and I like you because you're you. It's not complicated like grown-ups try to make it." His words illuminated the fundamental simplicity that Margaret had lost sight of in her efforts to justify her continued existence within the family structure. The grandfather clock chimed again, marking another passage of time that now felt precious rather than empty. Margaret realized that Tommy had given her something infinitely more valuable than reassurance. He had restored her understanding of her own intrinsic worth and her irreplaceable role in the intricate web of family connections that would continue long after current worries had been forgotten. As the golden afternoon light began its transition toward evening, Margaret felt something fundamental reorganizing itself within her worldview. The careful architecture of self-protection she had constructed over months of perceived rejection was crumbling, replaced by a structure built on the solid foundation of unconditional love that Tommy had helped her rediscover. She looked at her grandson with new eyes, seeing not just the child who had brightened her afternoon, but the messenger who had delivered her from a prison of her own making. The silence that settled between them was comfortable now, filled with the peaceful satisfaction that comes after important truths have been spoken and received. Margaret found herself studying the familiar objects in her living room, the photographs on the mantel, the quilt her mother had made, the books she had collected over decades of reading, and seeing them not as relics of a diminished life, but as evidence of a story still being written. Tommy seemed to sense the shift in his grandmother's demeanor, the way her shoulders had straightened slightly and her eyes had regained some of their old sparkle. Children are remarkably sensitive to emotional atmospheres, and he could feel the heaviness that had surrounded her beginning to lift like fog burning off in morning sunlight. His impromptu visit had accomplished something he hadn't consciously intended, but had somehow known was necessary. "Grandma," he said softly, reaching across the space between their chairs to take her weathered hand in his small, warm one. "Will you call Mom tonight? I think she really wants to hear your voice." The simple request carried the weight of possibility, the promise of rebuilt connections and resumed conversations that had been interrupted by fear rather than lack of love. Margaret squeezed his hand gently, feeling the circulation of warmth and life flowing between them like a current that connected past, present, and future in one continuous stream of family love. For the first time in months, the prospect of reaching out didn't feel like an imposition, but like a gift she could offer, the gift of her presence, her voice, her continued place in the ongoing story of their family's evolution through time and change. The evening shadows were lengthening across the living room floor when Sarah's car finally pulled into the driveway, her arrival heralded by the familiar sound of tires on gravel and the soft slam of a car door. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but it was anticipation rather than anxiety that coursed through her veins. Tommy's afternoon revelation had transformed her perspective so completely that she found herself looking forward to the conversation with her daughter rather than dreading it. Tommy jumped up from his chair with the boundless energy that children seem to possess in infinite supply, but he paused before running to meet his mother. "Remember what I said, Grandma," he whispered conspiratorially, his small face serious with the importance of his message. "You're ours, and we're yours. That's all that matters." Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing through the hallway as he rushed to greet Sarah and undoubtedly explain his unauthorized expedition to his grandmother's house. Margaret rose more slowly, taking a moment to smooth her hair and straighten her sweater, preparing for a conversation that would be fundamentally different from any they had shared in recent months. She could hear Tommy's animated voice explaining his afternoon adventure, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to share the afternoon's revelations. The sound of his excitement was like music filling her previously silent house. When Sarah appeared in the doorway, Margaret saw her daughter's face clearly for the first time in months, not through the filter of her own insecurities and assumptions, but with the clarity that Tommy's honesty had provided. She saw worry there, yes, but also love, longing, and the same careful uncertainty that Margaret herself had been feeling. They had both been walking on eggshells, each trying to protect the other from imagined burdens. "Mom," Sarah began, her voice carrying years of accumulated worry and unexpressed affection, "I'm so sorry Tommy ran off like this. I hope he wasn't—" But Margaret stepped forward and wrapped her daughter in the kind of hug she had been holding back for months, the kind of embrace that said everything words couldn't adequately express about love, forgiveness, and the irreplaceable bonds that connect generations across time and misunderstanding. In the weeks that followed Tommy's transformation. After Tommy's visit, Margaret's house began to come alive again with the sounds and rhythms of family connection. Phone calls became frequent rather than carefully rationed. Visits were spontaneous rather than scheduled obligations. And conversations flowed with the natural ease that comes when people stop protecting themselves from the possibility of being unwanted. The silence that had once felt oppressive was replaced by the comfortable quiet of knowing that connection was always available, even in moments of solitude. Margaret found herself looking forward to each day with renewed purpose. Not because she had suddenly become more useful or capable, but because she had rediscovered her irreplaceable value as a keeper of family stories, a source of unconditional love, and a bridge between past and future. Tommy's simple wisdom had restored her understanding of aging, not as diminishment, but as the accumulation of wisdom, experience, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing one's place in the continuing story of family love. The small blue notebook she had started keeping after Tommy's visit gradually filled with observations, memories, and reflections that she planned to share with him as he grew older. Each entry was a testament to the truth he had helped her rediscover: that presence is a gift in itself, that love transcends utility, and that the quiet wisdom of those who have lived long enough to understand what truly matters is one of life's most precious resources. On quiet afternoons, when the golden light streams through her windows much as it had on that transformative Tuesday, Margaret would think about the profound simplicity of her grandson's message. She had learned that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths, that children often see clearly what adults complicate beyond recognition, and that love in its purest form asks for nothing more than the opportunity to continue flowing between hearts that recognize their fundamental connection. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to Voices After 50 for more true emotional tales about family, love, and the quiet lessons of life. And before you go, watch the next story on our channel. Another reminder that sometimes the smallest voices teach us the greatest truths.